All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Blu Ventures. Today, we're jumping into part two of our mini-series with Rajiv Mehta. If you tuned in last time, you know we talked all about how student founders can build fundable startups and avoid common pitfalls. In this second episode, we shift the focus to you, specifically how students like you can break into the world of venture capital. Rajiv shares his personal path to breaking into VC, what skills students should focus on developing, and how to use college as a stepping stone into this competitive industry. Whether you're just curious about VC or are already hustling to land your first role, this conversation is packed with practical insights and real talk on how to get your foot in the door. All right, let's get into this part two of our episode with Rajiv Mehta. Hope you all enjoy. All right, Rajiv, here we are back again. The second part of this dual episode. And this part is more on the VC career path. So how to break into venture capital as a student. So we've talked a little bit about what you do and everything like that. But specifically in regards to this episode, I want to know more about, rather than just how you got into VC, which you mentioned last episode, what were some key moves or relationships that helped you get there, and how important was networking in the entire process?
Networking is a huge aspect. And what I learned very quickly when trying to apply and trying to get into the VC space, it's not like financial services or consulting where you can just go, to a VC's website and there's a careers link and here's the roles of applying. You don't see that. So it really is a large network of who you know, and what you do and what you can provide. So what I did initially, obviously as a student, tap into the university's network, former alums, former, students, professors. That network can go a long way and is already a warm connection. So I'm sure there's probably people that you can connect with and get in touch with that are either entrepreneurs or that are either, investors in this space, and start utilizing those connections to be able to get yourself in front of people. And I think one of the easiest way to get yourself in front of people is by volunteering, whether that's your time, whether that's, volunteering some free work or just doing something to be able to get yourself exposure into this space. One thing that I did and I thought that was helpful is I looked up, all like the local pitch competitions, all the local organizations, angel groups, that were hosting events, happy hours, pitch competitions or something. And I reached out to see if they needed someone to volunteer. Very easy stuff. Someone to just, check people in at the front desk, hand out name tags, hold the clock for the pitch competition so I can tell the founders when the time is about to come up. But those things go a long way because one, you get exposure, you put yourself in this room with a lot of people that can potentially get you to where you want to be, or you also don't know how these relationships are going to build out. And you have to go into it with the understanding that it's not going to happen right then and there, but something can happen within 6 months or a year and a half or 2 years at that time. It's and one more piece from as far as trying to put yourself out there. If you're talking to people on LinkedIn or trying to cold call and reach out to people, always try to see if you can add some value. Whether that's doing some free research or providing an investment thesis or just like a couple pages of something that you feel passionate about, that this potential connection you're trying to reach out to either works in or has an opinion in. That goes a long way rather than just reaching out and saying, can I just have a coffee chat? It really differentiates yourself from the other competition in this space.
No, definitely. And so kind of going off of that point, let's say hypothetically a student decides today, right, that they want to, go down the VC route, right? If they were standing right in front of you, what advice would you give to them in terms of where they should start and also, like you mentioned, who they should be talking to because network is that important in VC?
I mentioned in our previous episode, there is no traditional path into VC, but what I'm seeing as far as what value you can bring to a VC, I think one of the easiest ways is having an entrepreneurial experience. So not even if you're just a founder, but if you're part of a team at a startup, you really have an understanding of the inner workings of what the startup landscape is about and how to really build a company, how to be lean. And if that, startup is able to grow, what it looks like to try to get non-dilutive funding or equity funding and what it's like to be on this side of the table. That can provide a lot of transferable skills and valuable experiences that VCs look for because you've been on this side, so now you can go on the other side and you really know some of the things that you can, highlight and tackle and try to identify some of the red flags that potentially you were a part of, not too long ago. I can speak from an early stage perspective. I think there's a more emphasis on the qualitative side than there is quant. Again, you can't really do a discount cash flow on a company that has no revenue. But what you can do is you can, really identify the market. You can identify and kind of look at and analyze the team, and the product and the tech. So a lot of those things, again, there's no really numbers or quant attached to it. But what you can do is really utilize, the resources and the people around you. And that could just be finding subject matter experts in this space and just picking their brain on some ideas, listening to podcasts. But I think what's really helpful is just getting yourself out into the field. When you start going to a lot of pitch competitions or go to some of these investor or entrepreneurial events, you get to talk to people that are extremely bright and really at the forefront of innovation. And that, sometimes it can pique your own curiosity and you can find yourself into a space that you really feel passionate about. And if you know, dive really deep into that, especially something like an industry or a sector or a subsector that, really resonates with you, then have an opinion on it. So that when you go to some of these networking events, you can really talk about it and you can really speak it up. And I think that kind of goes a long way as well.
So would you say it's best for a student, instead of just, throwing all their marbles out there, to instead find specific VCs or general industries that they're particularly interested in, only going towards that? Is that probably the better route, you're saying?
I think there's a good argument for that to be very strategic. And, if you are, let's say, extremely passionate about, climate tech, then you only look at, VC firms that invest in that space and you only go to the climate events. But honestly, the reality is you just want to get in this space. And it doesn't really matter what industry or what sector you're in. You just want to get in. So, I take that with a grain of salt. I think it's smart to be strategic. What I've done in the past is I've, built out a map of, the investors within my area or, within, the couple states around me as well. And then really drill it down as to what subsectors that they're investing in and what I can see that I can align myself with and what value I could potentially add to their firm. So that way, when I see them at some of these events, I really have an idea of who they are and I can start, making some type of conversation piece and connecting and talking to people internally. So you can cast a wide net, but have a strategic wide net so that when you're casting it, you kind of know which areas, that you want to, dive a little bit further down into, or which areas, you maybe want to keep high level.
No, yeah, 100%. And kind of going back to what you were talking about before, you talked about how, entrepreneurial experience, whether that be a startup, for example, or volunteering, whatever that is great for VC when you're just starting out. Kind of, I want to touch a little bit more onto this. What are those specific skills that VCs are hoping that you as a student would be able to kind of exhibit through your experience in the entrepreneurial world?
I would say one is hunger and passion, right? So in this space, in startups and in VC, and in the investing landscape, there's not a lot that's going to be very mundane. There's going to be a lot of change, and you got to be at the forefront of innovation. And so having that desire and that hunger to be in a very dynamic and adapting landscape is important. And it also comes with the coachability aspect that I mentioned on a previous podcast. Not only from a founder, but if you're trying to work in this VC space, you're going to be working with people that probably have had very successful careers that have built out a fund, either former C-suite levels or former very successful operators. So, being a fly on some of these meetings and being able to get exposure to how they think and how they want to go about their investment thesis can be very rewarding, especially when you're starting off in this space or you're trying to learn in this space, because obviously they're successful for a reason, and they're investing for a reason. So there's definitely some key takeaways that you can learn from that. And at the end of the day, I think it's the fire and the passion that you have that you really want to be in this space. And then more so, what you're doing to always keep yourself, I would say abreast of what's going on in the market and abreast of what's going on in technology. And that could be, reading books. I highly recommend taking a look at Venture Deals. It's a very dry book, but it's a really good book to help you understand what venture looks like from the eyes of an entrepreneur or from an entrepreneurial perspective. Podcasts are great as well. Sometimes I have a gripe with podcasts because the ones you listen to on the podcast are always the successful ones.
Hmm.
No one really talks about the failures in some of these. And I think you get a lot more learning from the failures than you do from the successes. And so that can go a long way. So when you're talking to people, when you're networking and you're talking to second time founders, third time founders, fourth time founders, I'm more curious about what did you learn from the first, 1 to 3, startups that you did that's now getting you to the successful one that you're doing now. And that can open up a great narrative.
No, definitely. Having those discussions are just so important, like you just said. And so this next sort of topic is very, very interesting. I was very excited to bring this up. It's about common misconceptions about VC. Like you said, the path to VC, especially as a student, is very obscure. There is no straight, direct path. And so this can lead to a lot of misconceptions. And I just was curious from your perspective, what do most students, or what do you perceive that potentially most students would or do get wrong about what working in VC is actually like?
um, it's not Shark Tank. I'll tell you that much. Shark Tank is a great, TV show from that perspective, but it's the reason it's a TV show and not reality. From a VC perspective, I think one of the things, especially coming into it, again, I can only speak onto the early stage perspective, is how much you probably thought, financials and quant analysis really takes a big piece of it. Um, it definitely is a piece, but it's doesn't take that big of a role in the early stage as it does potentially in like the later stage and the growth stages. Again, like I mentioned before, when you're looking at early stage startups, from ideation or from maybe even 6 months of revenue, it's hard to be able to really do a deep dive, analysis on that, especially if they potentially a pivot. There's going to be a revenue change, or they're still trying to figure out what the right pricing model is, from their customers. Can they really, increase their prices more? If when they introduce the pilot, it's great. Now I landed this customer, I can start increasing my prices over time, and they start pushing the limit. When they get these annual contracts, and when contracts get renewed, you increase the prices a little bit more, and you start seeing, all right, where's my sweet spot? Until things can start becoming more consistent, it's difficult. So I think what I mentioned before, it's a lot of qualitative that comes to it. Really a big analysis on the team, really looking at the market, really looking at the technology. Um, and I think what's helpful is, utilizing the resources and the people around you. Um, from my perspective, coming from the prior finance background of wealth management, it's very cutthroat. A lot of people from Morgan Stanley aren't really talking to the people at UBS or talking to the people at Merrill Lynch. But in the VC space, I found it to be a little bit different. There's a lot of collaboration there, especially in VCs that operate sometimes even in the similar industry and subsectors as you. There's a lot of deal flow sharing as well. At the end of the day, we're all trying to find the best deal, and there's a lot of sharing. Or even if I don't work in the same industry as you, if something comes across my desk that I know is not, my cyber expertise, but it's potentially in health tech, I may have a colleague at a different VC firm that this could be perfect alignment for her and her, firm. So I'm happy to share that deal, and vice versa. I get deals shared to me. Don't get me wrong. When it comes to term sheets and writing down safe notes and price rounds, there can be some very cutthroaty, I would say aggressive tactics in that. But from the initial stages, there is a lot more collaboration than what I was expecting.
Definitely. And I love that point specifically that you bring up about how, especially for early stage investment, how it's very, very qualitative. This actually reminds me, I remember I was at a pitch competition and a student was essentially pitching an AI tool specifically for early stage VC where it scrapes financial data for them and can make assumptions off of it through, reasoning models and things. And I remember one of the judges was just telling them, VC for early stage, just like you mentioned, it's not like you said, Shark Tank, where all the power is in the financials, all the power is in the numbers, right? It's very much about the people, about the idea, about what's behind it, about the competitor space. You talked a lot about competitor mode, these sort of things. So I think that's such an important point that founders need to hone in on if they're trying to build a startup, or students need to hone in on if they're trying to go into VC. I think that's really important to kind of grasp. And so the second misconception I wanted to cover with you is, you know, a lot of students are worried because, like you said, the path to VC isn't always a straight path. You don't always have a student in college that's just going to say, I want to get into VC. So is it realistic for a student to break into VC straight out of undergrad, or should they take maybe another path first?
It's definitely possible. I would say if you want to work in the VC space, there's a lot of potential transferable skills that you can gain in other areas that you can bring to a VC. I mentioned, working in a startup or having an entrepreneurial experience is definitely a great background, but even in any other industry, if you're working in finance and investment banking or in consulting, straight out of undergrad, there's a lot of opportunities for you to grow and develop a skill set that you can bring, to a VC firm. But at the same time, if you start off at a VC straight out of undergrad, there is a lot of coachability, and you can kind of get molded into how the culture is within the VC firm, and that could be very helpful for you to grow and kind of get molded within this industry and within this space. I can't speak for other VCs, but I think one area that would be really opportunistic is if you can land an internship or a venture fellowship with the VC firm. And I think VCs who are open to having venture fellows or interns, they understand that this is probably the very first exposure to venture capital, that this student is having. I was a venture fellow during my time at Georgetown. I was very fortunate for the firm that brought me in because I learned the ropes very quickly, and they took the time to train me and coach me. Throughout the spring semester where it was maybe part-time that I was working with them. So then when I came on full-time in the summer, I hit the ground running as, a representative of the firm. Having that exposure and trying to be, exposed into that space can be very helpful. But at the same time, I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be too down on myself if you can't land that VC job right away after undergrad. I'd say that's probably more common. And what you can do is still have that mindset and goal if you want to get into VC and start developing the skill sets that you think would be necessary to get yourself in that space. And again, in any industry that you potentially land into, you're going to develop something that can help you, but be very strategic in that aspect.
Definitely. And looking beyond these two misconceptions that I've mentioned, were there potentially any misconceptions that you were met with when you first went into the VC space?
That's a good question. A misconception that I potentially thought of. I touched upon it already, but I think just from an analysis standpoint of a quant versus qualitative, I thought it was going to be really heavy on the finance and the numbers, especially in the early stage. I also thought, just from a networking and a trying to obtain deal standpoint, it was, I would say, different. Just given my experience, working in finance before, I always used to walk into like a networking event or in a room, and I had this hat on of like, I need to try to obtain a client coming out of here. So I got to try to identify, which one of these individuals in this room, is looking, for a new, financial planner or financial team. And I got to come out of here and try to like really come out with a couple names or a couple cards that I can follow up on and see if I can lock down a client. Walking into networking events now with the VC hat on, it's the opposite. A lot of founders are coming up to me and saying, "Hey, give me your money. Like invest in us. This is what we're building." But also at the same time, if you want to find some really quality deals, you are going to have to compete with other VCs and other investors in this space. Obviously, you all want to get into a deal that you think would be attractive, not only from a returns perspective from a VC, but also that you think can be really a potential disruptor in whatever segment that you're investing in, and can really have that, like I said, hockey sticks growth and scale. So not only are you getting companies flooding your inbox, but you also have to be strategic in who you're trying to get out to on the outbox, and being very strategic with your time and who you're speaking with. Once you get some reps underneath you, you can very quickly understand if this is going to be a fit for your firm, and if it really fits your investment thesis, or if it's something that you maybe want to share with someone else or move on from fairly quickly. But that just takes time, and I think having some experience in this space. And for full disclosure, I'm no expert, VC or an expert investor. I'm sure there are a lot of people who have way more years and experience, than me that can provide some different advice, but I can only give you from the lens of what I've seen so far.
Awesome. And so now kind of stepping into final takeaways and advice in regards to this whole space of the career path with VC for students. Before even going towards, advice for a student that knows that they want VC, for those who it may just be in the air, it may be a potential option, how do you recommend they figure out whether the VC path is the right one for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think trying to get as much exposure into this space as you can. One, go to pitch competitions, try to join, a lot of networking groups and try to find opportunities that you can try to brush off some of those skills. I mentioned the venture capital investment competition, that's available on the undergrad and a graduate level. So I would, really try to see if your university offers an opportunity to get into that. Or if not, work with the university team and your student body group to see if you can get a representation for your university out there. Because it's a phenomenal way to get exposure into the VC space, really talk to some brilliant minds, but also you get to collaborate with some students that are like-minded like yourself. Don't be afraid to reach out, to VCs. It's a tough game, especially in like in trying to go in cold on LinkedIn. But like I mentioned previously, if you reach out to them and just, it's very hard to say no to a student. Coming from when I was in that space and I was reaching out to VCs, you're more likely to talk to a student than you are maybe like another founder that's trying to come and pitch their idea within that whatever 200 character limit in LinkedIn. But what you can see is if you're very passionate and you really do your research on some of the people that you see that work at some VC firms that maybe you have in high regard. There's potential an opportunity for you to just do some free work for them, sit in on a due diligence call, have a coffee chat with them, and you can get exposure in any way that you can. Like I mentioned, volunteering your time it can really go a long way. I would say more so than just trying to set up a coffee chat with somebody. Everyone's trying to do that. What more can you do? So that's a really good opportunity to try to get exposure into that space. Um, you know, read the resources, keep yourself abreast on what's going on and the technology and a market perspective. And I think there's also has to be some type of little passion in there as well. It doesn't necessarily be for having an entrepreneurial passion or an investment passion, but there's got to be some type of segment or sector or industry that you really care passionately about. And if you are always, reading and trying to understand, how that, space is innovating, that can be very helpful, like, because that's what VCs are looking at. We're always trying to invest in the next big thing.
Right. Awesome, fantastic. And once again, just like last episode, to our listeners who may have just listened and hopped into this episode, where can they follow your work and learn more about what you do?
Yeah, happy to connect with those on LinkedIn. Zaki, feel free to share my link right there. Like I mentioned to you, I don't have a lot of the social media, so LinkedIn will probably be the best resource.
Awesome, awesome. Well, Rajiv, once again, thank you so much. This has been an amazing two-part series. I really appreciate it. I have no doubt that our students, and our listeners now have a full breadth of knowledge towards whatever perspective they want to take on VC, whether they're a founder, whether they want to hop into VC. So once again, I appreciate all your advice, your insight, and just for you being here, man.
No, I'm honored to be a part of the podcast, Zaki. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you again. Hopefully, I was able to help out a little bit. But again, really appreciate the time and honored to be here.
Of course, thank you so much. All right, have a good one.
Thanks, Zaki.
All right, that wraps up part two of our two-part miniseries with Rajiv Mehta. If you've made it this far and tuned into both halves of the conversation, thank you so much. This miniseries was designed to give student founders and aspiring VCs a rare inside look at both sides of the table, right? So, what it takes to build a fundable startup and what it takes to break into venture capital. So, before closing off this episode, let's lock in on a few key final takeaways. First, breaking into VC starts with breaking out of the cold email mold, right? Venture capital is a relationship driven space. And if there's one thing Rajiv made clear, it's that you need to add value before you ask for time. This could mean sending a short thesis, doing some quick research, or just proving that you've put in the effort before hitting connect. In a world without application portals or job listings, your network is your application. Second, do not overlook the power of entrepreneurial experience. One of the best ways to make your way into VC is by building something of your own. Whether it scales or fails, the lessons you gain as a founder, which are adaptability, resilience, strategic thinking, and more, translate directly into what makes a great investor. You don't have to follow the traditional corporate route to get in. In fact, building a startup may be the best training there is. And again, a huge thank you to Rajiv Mehta for joining me on Dorm Room Ventures. If you enjoyed this two-part format, let me know and we'll keep them coming. All right, that's all for this episode. Until next time, this is Dorm Room Ventures.